Alfie began to make his way up the driveway, feeling rather conspicuous. A small boy arriving alone in short trousers, a woolly jumper and a cap, after all, was obviously neither a doctor, a patient, nor a student arriving for the lecture. The path itself was very well kept and separated two wide fields on either side with a straight line that led to the hospital entrance. The lawns were carefully tended, although there were no flowers anywhere in sight. Instead, the grass had that strange striped look that lawns in country houses often have, where it appears as if one strip of grass is leaning one way while the other is leaning in the opposite direction. When he reached the top of the drive, he stopped in front of a grand portico that led to a pair of open oak doors hiding behind a pillar as he considered his next move. Two young women came out in uniforms completely different to Marge's. They didn't look quite so formal, and their blouses were much looser at the neck, and stood in the fresh air, smoking cigarettes, oblivious to his presence behind them.
"And where was Dr. Ridgewell when all this was happening?" asked the first girl. "Where do you think he was?" replied the second. "Sitting in his office, head down, keeping out of the way. And he didn't even come out to speak to her."
"That's terrible, sorry."
"He had no choice in the end. She said that she wouldn't leave until he did, that they could call the police for all she cared. When he came out at last, you should have seen the expression on his face. Furious he was. 'What are you causing such a fuss for?' he asked her." "What did she say?" "For the best reason in the world. For love."
Alfie gasped and put a hand to his mouth in surprise. This was the same expression that Mr. Janacek always used when he explained why he had moved from Prague to London.
"Poor woman,"
said the first nurse, exhaling deeply and shaking her head.
"She's devoted to him, isn't she?" "Well, of course she is. He's her husband. You'd do anything for your Frank, wouldn't you?" "Probably, yes. But look, I know it's a terrible thing to say, but there are times when I'm grateful he was injured early on. It kept him away from the worst of it. It gets him down, of course, not being able to do his bit anymore. But I say to him, 'Frank,' I say, 'you want to see what those poor boys are like out here at the East Suffolk? You want to count your blessings, Frank?' I don't hold back, Elsie, and he's telling sometimes." "How's his walking now?" "Not good. And his spirits?" "Even worse."
Alfie slipped round to the other side of the pillars so they wouldn't notice him, and then, while their backs were still turned, he ran into the lobby, where a set of glass doors awaited him, through which he could make out movement in a corridor beyond. 3 more nurses were walking in and out of rooms on either side of the hall, while a fourth was deep in conversation with a much older doctor who had a white beard and looked a little like Santa Claus. While their attention was diverted, Alfie opened the doors, ran through and slipped into the first room on his left. The first thing he noticed in the hospital was the smell, a mixture of cleaning fluids, perspiration, blood, and who knew what else. Something foul. It pervaded the air and made him want to gag, but instead he put a hand over his nose until he could grow accustomed to it. Looking around, he thought he was in an office of some sort. There was a table in the centre of the room, and on it stood a few empty mugs and a teapot with a knitted cosy on top. Hanging over the side of a chair was an apron with a map of Ireland on it, and the words, "A gift from Skibbereen," underneath. A tea room, Alfie decided, not an office. Somewhere the nurses came to take the breaks. A sound to his left made him turn, and he noticed a kettle on the stove with steam starting to rise through its spout. The moment it began to whistle, he gasped, knowing he had only a few seconds before someone appeared and discovered him. Running back out into the corridor, he made his way a little further along, trying to ignore the faint echo of moaning in the air, a noise that was difficult to decipher. It sounded as if 100 people were in distress behind these doors. He ducked into another room, this time on the right-hand side of the hall, just as he heard footsteps running down to where he had come from. Closing the door behind him, he turned round with his eyes closed in relief and exhaled. When he opened them again, he saw that he was in a bedroom. A man was lying in bed next to an open window, sitting up, his pyjama top unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He had thin, grey hair, and although his face did not look so very old, he was staring at Alfie with a terrified expression on his face, his mouth hanging open, his hands pressed to his ears to block out the noise of the whistling kettle, whose scream penetrated even here. Alfie looked at him, aghast, not knowing what to say, and only when the whistling stopped a few moments later did the man take his hands away slowly, very slowly and let them rest on top of his blanket. He stared down at them then, his mouth still open, before turning to look at Alfie. He was trembling slightly. In a bed opposite him, a second man was reading a novel. When he got to the end of every page, he ripped it out, crumpled it up, and threw it on the floor. There were dozens of pages down there already. Alfie narrowed his eyes to make out the words on the front cover. Madame Bovary. "Where's my mum?" asked the first man, and Alfie turned back and opened his mouth, uncertain what to say. "Is she outside?" he asked finally. "She said she'd come this morning." I don't think so," said Alfie. "I haven't seen any visitors out there." "Hey, you!" said the second man, waving an arm in the air as if he was a child in a classroom. He held the book up. "She has a fancy man, you see." "Make it stop, please," said the first man, bending forward and closing his eyes. "Make what stop?" "Her husband doesn't know about him," laughed the second man. "She's French, though, and you know what they're like. They'd hop on anything." The first man made a sudden lunge forward in the bed, and Alfie jumped in fright, pulled open the door and ran quickly back out into the corridor, where he turned a corner and found himself in a ward where 10 beds were lined up, 5 on either side, each one occupied. The moaning sound had been coming from here. Each man seemed to be in terrible pain. Some had bandages all over their heads. Some had tubes emerging from their bodies with dark red blood either being put in or taken out of them. He felt his stomach twist in fright and looked at the man in the bed next to him, who had no sheets over his body and was simply lying on top of his mattress, making very slight movements as if he could not bear to be lying down much longer. Alfie stared at him. Something wasn't right, but it took him a moment to realise what. The man had no left arm, just a stump that ended above the elbow, and his right leg had been amputated at the knee. Both wounds were exposed, and a trolley holding clean dressing stood next to the bed. Someone must have been attending to him and got called away. Whoever had answered the kettle's whistle, perhaps. Alfie tried not to stare at the angry, pulpy places where the limbs came to an unnatural end, but it was difficult not to. He could see chaotic stitching, and the skin had been folded in upon itself, leaving a wrinkled knot with something resembling a black nail at the centre. Yellowing bandages surrounded his skull, and an eye patch covered one of his eyes. Alfie looked at him in horror, and the man turned slowly, his one eye blinking as his hand reached out and took hold of Alfie's. The boy gasped, tried to pull away, but the man, despite his injuries, was too strong for him, dragging him closer, hissing something under his breath. Alfie reached a hand out to push himself away from the mattress, but it landed on something soft and moving. A bottle filled with some dark yellow fluid that fell over as Alfie's hand touched it, spilling its contents on the floor by his feet. And as he pulled away from the man, he slipped in the liquid and fell to the floor, realising that he'd landed in a puddle of the man's urine, and it was all he could do not to scream out loud as he scrambled to his feet and ran from the room. His father couldn't be here. It wasn't possible. No one could be in a place like this and not go mad. Out in the corridor again, he gasped for air, wondering whether he was going to be sick as he held his wet hands in front of his face before wiping them on his trousers. There was blood there too, he realised. Blood from the man's urine. Alfie turned round, desperate to get away from these horrors, and started to walk down another corridor, confused now, disorientated, wondering why he'd ever thought it was a good idea to come here at all. His legs felt weak beneath him, the way they did when he had that dream where he couldn't run at all and his feet were like 10-ton weights. He hoped he might find a door that would take him back outside, but instead the corridor led to a nurse's station, and beyond that, another set of glass doors. He desperately wanted to go through them, but there were 2 people standing by the station, a young doctor and a nurse, talking in concerned voices. If he went that way, they would certainly see him. He crouched low in front of the desk, happy now that he was not tall enough to see over the ticket counter at King's Cross, for this desk was about the same height. "Which ones?" asked the doctor, who spoke in a very posh voice. "B-wing or C-wing?" "Oh, C-wing, doctor," said the nurse in an Irish accent, and Alfie wondered whether she was the person who brought the tea towel with the map on it. "Dr. Edgerton says that all 4 of them are to get their final assessments this week." But what's the hurry? They have another month of recovery ahead of them at least.
Oh, they're wanted back, she said, and although Alfie couldn't see her, he knew that she was shrugging her shoulders. It's ridiculous, of course, but I don't see what I can do.
I can do something, he insisted, his voice growing angrier.
Then do, Arthur, she said. Those men won't survive another month over there. It's criminal to send them back. My God, if the War Office has no thought for their well-being, let them at least consider the other soldiers whose lives will be put in danger by their presence.
You're preaching to the converted, said the doctor irritably. Look, leave it with me. All right, I'll do what I can. If I have to kick up a fuss, I will. Now, what about those fellows up on the 3rd floor? What can we do with... And at this was the moment when Alfie, without any warning, sneezed. He froze, grimacing, hoping against hope that they hadn't heard him, but of course that was impossible. A moment later, the doctor and nurse had come round to the front of the desk and were staring down at him.
What on earth? Asked the nurse.
Who are you? Snapped the doctor, who looked furious to encounter a 9-year-old boy sitting on the floor.
I got lost, said Alfie.
Lost? Lost how? What are you doing here anyway? Speak up, boy!
Alfie said the first thing that came into his head. My father's the milkman, he told them, which wasn't entirely a lie. I've been helping him with his rounds, which was. The pair stared at him, then at each other, then back at him.
The supplies are delivered round the back of the hospital, said the doctor, turning away. As you should know by now. Go back out that way.
He indicated a side door that led to the grounds.
Don't come back in here again, do you hear me? There are sick men in this hospital. They don't need a child running around spreading who knows what diseases. By God, you stink as well. You smell as if you've wet yourself. Don't you ever bathe? Get out, for pity's sake.
Alfie turned on his heel and ran through the door, his heart beating wildly. His cap fell off and he ran back to retrieve it, and for a moment he thought that the nurse was looking at him as if she knew he was lying, but he didn't dare say anything, and so turned again and ran back outside.